to campus today. As you may know from some of the materials that have been circulated, Dr. Geek is an associate professor of Russian culture and the program in education at Duke University. She's also the former director of comparative international studies, which is an undergraduate major at Duke. She's a licensed clinical social worker for Duke Hospice, and also operates a private psychotherapy practice in aging, illness, and wellness transitions, and she specializes in PEP. She combines that clinical and academic work in the courses that she teaches on medical ethics and end-of-life care, research on trauma and gulag, as I've already mentioned, and the current research project in which she's engaged on hospice care in Russia. She has published several books, including a monograph entitled Finding the Middle Ground, Kryskovsky, Tour, and the Power of Ambivalence in 19th Century Russian Women's Prose. And she's also co-edited a number of collections, to which I should add that I refer quite often for my own research work. One of them is entitled An Improper Profession, Women, Gender, and Journalism in Late Imperial Russia, also a history of Russian women writers, Russian women, experience and expression, and finally, Gulag Voices, oral histories of Soviet detention and exile. And I'd simply note that the last of those volumes includes the very first interviews with Gulag survivors to be published in English. So her talk today is entitled The Mortal Body, Russian and American Ways of Not Knowing. So please join me in welcoming Professor Geek back to campus.
Thank you all. It's good to be back in Sewanee, actually. So, Gina Barr, the former head of women's studies at Duke, likes to tell the story of how her doctor once advised her that she needed to take a week off work for a medical condition. And she looked at him and she said, I can't do that. I have this academic commitment, I have that academic commitment. There's no way I could possibly take a week off work. And the doctor said patiently, Jean, it's really clear that you have a very good head on your shoulders, but what is going to carry that head around if your body can't do it? Jean took the week off. So this story for me encapsulates how many of us sort of see our bodies as an interruption, right? And also what Carolyn Bynum, whose words frame this conference, states in her 1995 article, Why All the Fuss About the Body, when she says that in our academic discourse about the body, the lived body seems to disappear. Can you guys hear me? I can never tell with mics. Okay. So I'm going to suggest that one of the main reasons that the lived body disappears is that we don't want to know our mortality. And that's a point that's in one way so obvious that you don't need to make it, and in another way it needs to be made over and over again. Our not knowing mortality is limiting in many, many ways, and I'm going to argue today that it's an avoidance of the radical vulnerability that deeper knowledge of mortality involves, and also that it means that we cannot participate in one of the two greatest transitions in our lives. So our lives are full of transitions. Coming to Sewanee is a transition, but the two biggest are coming in and going out. And coming in, we don't have a lot of choice about how conscious we're going to be, but going out, we actually do have some choice. And I'm going to suggest today that not knowing our mortality limits not just how we know about death and dying, it also limits how we approach and reproduce knowledge in both society and the academy. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about knowledge in terms of medical and end-of-life choices in the US, and then I'll move to a discussion of Russia, where, as Elizabeth said, I'm conducting a project on Russian hospice. So in my work with clients in my private practice and as a hospice social worker, I see over and over that people have to make critical decisions about care for themselves or for somebody they love while they're in crisis, and that they have little or no context for making those decisions. They haven't had information or a realistic way to think about it before literally life and death decisions have to be made. So suddenly they're having to decide things like whether they want CPR or not, chemo or not, to go on hospice or not. And things like CPR, most of us get our information from Grey's Anatomy or other shows like that. And that shows, a study showed that in Grey's Anatomy, on Grey's Anatomy and other shows like that, 70% of the time when you have CPR, you recover. In actual fact, it's at best 8% and more like 3%. So our impressions of these things and the actuality are very different. It's also hard for doctors to give accurate information about these cases. As Atul Gawande shows in his wonderful book, Being Mortal, doctors very often give very incomplete information. They might recommend chemo, for example, but not tell you how it will affect your immune system or give you a realistic sense of what your life is likely to be like while you're in treatment. And that really matters because your priority might be taking a trip or seeing your grandchildren, and you're not given the choice to make a fully informed decision about that. So those are two costs, making choices in crisis or with very limited information. That's one or two, depending on how you count the cost of not knowing. And I think that the cost of not having this conversation about mortality as a culture, those costs are very high. So I have a sort of a taboo question. My students tell me that it is easier, that they know way more about death and are more comfortable talking about it than their parents. But I want to just ask for a show of hands. How many of you have been with somebody who is dying? Many of you, actually. And so I'll ask you just to hold in your mind for a moment. I hope it's not too painful, but what picture of death do you have in mind, what you think it looks like? That's for everybody, those of you who've seen it and who haven't. And then I'm going to start by telling several stories of the deaths I've seen with people I've worked with, so I've changed all of the names and some of the circumstances. So the first one is a peaceful death, so I'll start you off easy. Mary, a woman who had terminal pancreatic cancer, living in a skilled nursing facility. She had not wanted to know she was dying, so we couldn't say when we went into the room, we couldn't say we were hospice. We had to say, instead of saying we're from Duke Hospice, we had to say we're from Duke. She received symptom management so that her breathing and pain were bearable. And about a week after she came on to hospice, as I stood with her son and daughter-in-law talking about something unrelated, Mary's breathing slowed and she drifted off. There had been no plan for picking up Mary's body after her death, and because it was a skilled nursing facility and she had a roommate, we had to think about that right away and make those arrangements. So for this one, to me, the cost of not knowing was relatively low, except maybe to the roommate. For family members, it is true that having to think about the funeral home instead of about what had just happened was difficult for them. On the other hand, not knowing, it could be argued, was a good thing as it allowed Mary to slip away in the midst of a family conversation. Yet her family members were shocked at her death, and it took them a very long time to integrate her death. They had no real sense that this could happen, even as they saw her weakening. The second story is of Elena, an undocumented Latina woman dying of cancer, a lymphoma. She also did not want to know that she was dying and said that it was far too soon to talk about plans, advance directives, or anything of that kind. She was a woman of this incredible dignity, and I really wish I could show you she was walking around in pain, but with this ramrod straight back and with her walker. And she just would brook no conversation about this. She would pray, she said, and we would talk again. A week later, she was dying, and we moved her to the inpatient facility. There was no money to cover burial costs, and this meant that the Department of Social Services would pay to have her cremated. This was all knowledge I knew ahead of time, but we couldn't talk about it. So if we had talked earlier, Elena's body could have been repatriated to her country of origin for a burial. And it was hugely important to her to be buried in alignment with her Christian beliefs. Yet there was no money for this. She was already not conscious, but I went in to tell her what was happening, and I felt her breathing slow and become calm and even, and she died shortly thereafter. I wasn't there for that, but other people told me about her death. So the cost of not knowing here is that what happened to her body is not what she wanted, and that was deeply important to her. My third story is of Susan, a daughter who didn't want to know that her mother was dying. Just 2 weeks ago, said Susan, her mother had been taking care of her grandbabies, assuring she would do that again. When I looked at her mother, I saw a very different picture. She looked quite close to death to me. I gently tried to suggest that there might be a possibility that this wasn't going to come out as Susan wished. She insisted that it would, and after a while, I and the hospice nurse simply said, "We hope that what you're wanting will happen." Susan then, without telling us, moved her mother from Susan's home to her mother's home in a van. I had offered to set up ambulance transport for her, but Susan didn't want that, so she moved her late at night without telling us. So I ache at the thought of that fragile body bouncing around in the van. 3 days later, Susan's mother died. I called Susan, and she yelled at me for not paying enough attention to her. I got defensive, but I bit it back and I listened, and that was my job, to listen to that anger and to hold it with her. The certain cost of not knowing for Susan's mother was that she was rattled around a lot in her last few days. Other costs I think we can guess at, but can't know. And for Susan, the costs included that she was not able to be with her mother very directly in this important time. Because Susan could define hope only as her mother getting better, and that's true for many people, there's a way I believe that she missed being with her mom through one of the biggest transitions in her mother's life. And she missed being able to provide the kind of care that Susan deeply wanted to provide. It seems to me that a large part of what lies behind the not knowing in all three of these cases is that we don't have a cultural conversation that teaches us about the mortal life, that allows talking about death to be a natural part of life, that allows us to share information, fears, understanding, and the gifts of mortality. Nothing in Susan's life, and in most of our lives, taught her that death comes to us all and that there can be signs to look for that a body is getting closer to dying, that knowing that one is going to die is not giving up, and that there are ways to be present with the person in that transition to death. Susan and we, as a culture, do not have a vocabulary for what mortality actually looks like, or how to redefine hope in the light of mortality. In Russia, the problem of not knowing about mortality for terminally ill patients is largely about pain management. In a 2012 interview I conducted with Nyuta Federmesser, who is the head of Fond Vera at the first Moscow hospice, actually the second hospice founded in Russia but cleverly named, she said, "Most Russians think that if you have a cancer diagnosis, you're supposed to die in pain. That is the expectation. Both doctors and patients expect this." She repeated nearly the same words in a 2015 interview with Echo Moskva, a radio program and online platform. That is, even after various legislative reforms improving the dispensation of pain medications had been passed. A second example in the Russian case is journalist and playwright Natalia Antonova, who said about the bard Ali Yakusheva's death in October 2012, quote, "I had heard that Yakusheva was battling cancer, but what I hadn't realized is that her doctors had denied her pain medication on the basis of some bureaucratic error. When her relatives confronted them about her suffering, they were curtly told, 'Everyone suffers.'" Only on her final day alive was Yakusheva allowed some dignity and peace a hospice doctor had her transferred to a palliative care facility. She was given a shot of morphine, curled up, and slept for what was probably the first time in a month. The following morning, Yakusheva passed away peacefully. Diana Nevzorova, the head of palliative medicine at the Health Ministry in Russia, stated last year that only 4% of cancer patients in Moscow receive adequate pain treatment, and that across the country, only 8.8% receive necessary opiate-based pain relief. And this has led to a catastrophic situation. Some of you may know that in February of 2015, there were 11 suicides of terminally ill patients in Moscow who could not gain access to pain medications. In Russia in March, there were at least 8 more suicides for the same reason, in March of 2015. And that situation improved a bit last fall and has closed down again. And factors that make it difficult to access pain medications in Russia include bureaucratic barriers, attitudinal barriers, legal barriers, and problems of cost and supply. And I can say more about any of those you're interested in the question and answer period, but I'm going to focus here briefly on attitudes and legal barriers, both of which I think create a kind of feedback loop of not knowing. Many articles detail that the priority in Russia is that drugs not be diverted for uses other than pain relief. That is, most doctors and officials are more concerned about patients selling their drugs or becoming addicts than they are about the problem of pain. Earlier, I cited Antonova and Yakusheva's death, and Antonova also states, quote, Yakusheva's doctors went as far as accusing her relatives of trying to use the dying woman's condition to score drugs for themselves. As Antonova points out, the fact that this happened to someone who was a public personality indicates the scope of the problem in Russia. So, hospice in Russia is the one place that offers some release from pain, some pain management, but even then the options are profoundly limited. Hospices are only for cancer patients. In the U.S., hospice covers other things like pulmonary disease, heart, and other diseases. And in Russia, there are usually long waiting lists. So once you make it into hospice, you can stay as long as you want, which is not true in the U.S. as long as you need to. But so the access problems are different. Hospices in Russia are regional, with some exceptions. Each hospice serves only those in a given region. And I'm going to give you one story that illustrates all the barriers, bureaucratic, attitudinal, medical, social, and legal, although focuses on that illustrates all of them. A woman named Maria tells the story of taking care of her mother, Lydia Ilyina, in the last year of her mother's life in 2014. Lydia Ilyina had had a number of strokes and heart attacks, and she had what was diagnosed as a benign brain tumor. Maria, quote, she was suffering a lot. She couldn't eat or drink. I fed her with a pipette. Her whole body hurt. Her doctor said that there was practically no chance that Mama could survive. So I tried to find ways to at least lessen her suffering. She was told that only the chief doctor had the right to authorize pain medication, so Maria went to her. The chief doctor, the head doctor, said that for patients like my mama, painkillers could not be prescribed and advised her to take clonazepam. That's a benzodiazepam that was developed in the USSR in the 1970s. It's a fairly, it doesn't have a huge effect on pain. Then Maria went to a neurologist who said, quote, that because the tumor was benign, Mama couldn't be prescribed painkillers. They didn't acknowledge her to be an oncology patient. They wouldn't prescribe morphine or tramadol. Maria then turned to a hospice where people had sympathy for her, but they said they could take her mother for a brief period, but not as a patient, just so that Maria could have a break. They added that even they didn't have the right to prescribe painkillers because of the diagnosis. And other doctors kept insisting that Maria's mother didn't need narcotics or palliative care. Maria describes herself as, quote unquote, having hysterics in the doctor's office because it was so hard to see her mother suffer, and because Maria was taking care of her mother alone and raising her own son, a situation that many people find themselves in. Maria said to the doctor, "If you won't get me narcotics for my mother legally, then I'll get them illegally." The doctor reported Maria to the authorities, accused her of shooting up drugs herself and killing her mother with them. Maria has denied everything, but as late as last November, which is the last time I was able to get information about this, the criminal case against her had not been closed, and she was afraid that she would continue to be prosecuted. All of the independent sources I've seen indicate that Maria is not any kind of drug addict and that her story can be trusted. And so her experience, along with many others that show that this story is sadly unexceptional, is an illustration of why terminally ill people and their caregivers in Russia are moved to desperate measures to deal with pain. There are, as I said, many reasons for this focus on legal issues and on possible addiction rather than providing needed drugs for terminal patients. Reasons including bureaucracy, issues of access to medication, cost and supply. I think when you know that the education and health budget together in Russia today comprise about 3% of the total budget and the military 30% of that budget, that tells you a lot. But at the same time, all of these causes, while important, seem to me to be on some level proximate causes with a deeper underlying cause. And perhaps why is the wrong question, another distraction on a certain level. I want to suggest that the lack of pain medications in Russia is also related to a lack of a certain kind of understanding of what it means to be a dying body. That knowledge, a deep knowledge of mortality, demands a radical vulnerability. And I will end by talking about knowledge, mortality, and vulnerability with a brief excursus, just to say, as I was getting this paper ready, it was shocking to me to realize that in Russia the acceptance of death is no higher than it is in the U.S. It probably shouldn't have been, but it was. In my work on the Gulag, I read about prisoners having to face mortality on a daily basis, including digging mass graves for other prisoners. In my work on literature, it's a truism that Russians know and communicate about suffering much more directly and regularly than we in the U.S. do. I want to be careful with that. I think we often think, oh, Russia's the suffering culture, and I don't want to go there. But I do think one of the things that has attracted me to Russian literature is that there is a way that suffering is talked about differently than it usually is in the U.S. So this I am extremely interested in, and as you'll see in a minute, I'm not ready to make authoritative statements about it yet. But I will say just that an author, Nunya, her real name, that's her pseudonym, Nunya Bashsyagin, who was born in Armenia and writes in Russia, published what is really the only thing, the only novel, if it's a novel, about hospice. It's called Dnevnik Druziei, A Diary for Friends. It's a much acclaimed, it came out in 2015, it's a much acclaimed diary, like, I would call it creative nonfiction, I've seen it called a novel, account of her experiences in a hospice in East Berlin. Most of the account focuses on her daily interactions with hospice patients, what they like to eat, how they talk amongst themselves, and issues like who can walk and who can't becomes a major issue. She shows how living close to death helps her understand people and life better. Tellingly, both descriptions of the book and reviews focus heavily on such statements as, and this is a quotation, the author discovers that one can have deep relationships with people who are dying. This should not be news. But because we don't know mortality, it is news. What possibilities might be opened in knowing our mortality in a different way? I'm going to speak to the U.S. context primarily in this last section, although the reaction to Nunya's diary, as well as frequent social media, radio, and other discussions of hospice in Russia, show that these are active questions there. But as I was thinking about the paper, I realized I'm really not ready yet to discuss what it means to be vulnerable and to know the mortality of the body in a fuller way in Russia. I'm happy to talk about that in question and answer. First, of course, there's a reordering of priorities when you think about an end point, right? I'm sort of surprised that I'm going to be quoting from Steve Jobs, but I'm going to quote from Steve Jobs. In his 2005 Stanford commencement speech, he said, "Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you're going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart." Those words have a lot of poignancy since he died 4 years later. It's a great speech. It's on YouTube if any of you are interested in seeing it. He tells 3 stories of his life, and they're all really quite wonderful stories. So that's one of, I think, the value of looking at mortality in this way. And there is what I hope I made clear in my opening to the paper, that we can have better experiences of dying and create better experiences for those we love who are dying by creating a different kind of cultural conversation about mortality. But I think there are things we can do as educators also. And I'll end by talking about a recent discussion I had in class. And I really hope that in the question and answer period, others of you will discuss your experience as students, teachers, parents, daughters, sons. So a few years ago, I realized that given that I was seeing the tremendous costs of this lack of knowledge about mortality, and given that I'm a professor, I could teach about it. And I do, most recently in a course, as Elizabeth mentioned, on medical ethics and end-of-life care, a course in which students also complete service learning assignments at Duke's Cancer Center, Duke Hospice, the VA Hospice, the Ronald McDonald House, a skilled nursing facility, and a retirement facility, a continuous care facility. This is difficult knowledge for them, but they respond to it really, really well, having intense conversations with each other and with their parents. Hopefully, these students will shape policy on aging and end-of-life care in this country, and hopefully they will be better doctors because they have thought seriously about issues of mortality before they go into medical school. But my students have trouble with the radical vulnerability that serious engagement with knowing the mortality of our bodies demands. An example is the response to an interview I asked them to listen to with Bruce Kramer, former Dean of the College of Education, Leadership, and Counseling at St. Thomas in Minnesota. Kramer is the author of We Know How This Ends, and his interview in the show, and the blog, The Dis-Ease Diaries. He died of ALS about a year ago. His writings and his interview in the show On Being with Krista Tippett show someone who's facing a really difficult death. ALS is difficult in the sense of your body shuts down and your mind stays fairly stable. So he faces that difficult death and integrates that knowledge into his life, I think, as fully as a person can. He talks about how having ALS has revealed much to him, including other people's stories of pain, which they tell only when they know his story. He states in the interview, quote, "I knew I wasn't going to be cured. It would be with me for as long as I lived, as long as this body continued to live. It became almost an acknowledgement that in the room, in this room, right now, as we are sitting here, each one of us holds almost a personage sitting next to us, abiding in the gut, living in our breath. And that personage defines who we are in so many ways." And what I kept hearing was but I think this is one of the best descriptions I've ever read of what it means to live with an active knowledge of mortality. So in a fun-filled getting to know dying from the inside out section of the class, I have had my students read Death at Ivany Ilyich by Tolstoy, a story of a dying man in 19th century Russia, and then listen to this interview with Bruce Kramer. When they read such statements as the one I just quoted, they didn't believe it. They said, "We don't believe that somebody could approach their dying with that much idealism, but we can't figure out why he'd lie. Do you have any ideas about that?" I did. In the next class period, I asked them to do an exercise that they didn't have to show anyone else about a time that they had felt vulnerable. I asked them to do a free write in 11 minutes about what they experienced at the time, how they understood it now, and what had helped them get through it. When we moved to large group discussion, I asked them if anyone could see a relationship between this exercise and the Bruce Kramer podcast. I was kind of shaking in my shoes, thinking that no one would, but they all did, saying that they had not wanted to understand his deep vulnerability. It was too scary to them. But that seeing that changed their perspective on just about everything else they did in this class. They moved on to do great specific projects that included a young person's guide on how to talk with parents about end-of-life issues. Another person did a study of the catastrophic lack of geriatricians we're facing and how to better work with it, work he's actually continuing this semester. A third did a wonderful project on LGBTQ issues and end-of-life care. Almost every student in the class said that the vulnerability exercise had shifted the class dynamic entirely and opened them up to a different way of understanding mortality, among other things. So that's one way that including the mortal body without making it disappear can shift our ways of knowing. I believe that there are many ways that grounding our knowledge and our ways of producing knowledge in our mortal bodies can shift our ways of knowing and being in the world. That's an ongoing discussion. I look forward to whatever parts of it you want to discuss here. And I'm going to close with the words of poet David Whyte. He says, "Vulnerability is not a weakness, a passing indisposition, or something we can arrange to do without. Vulnerability is not a choice. Vulnerability is the underlying, ever-present, and abiding undercurrent of our natural state. To run from vulnerability is to run from the essence of our nature. The attempt to be invulnerable is the vain attempt to become something we're not. More seriously, in refusing our vulnerability, we refuse the help needed at every turn of our existence and immobilize the essential, tidal, and conversational foundations of our identity. The only choice we have as we mature is how we inhabit our vulnerability."
Thank you. I have so many things that I selfishly want to ask myself, but instead I will yield the floor to the many of you who I'm sure want to ask questions as well. Yes.
So you just said that how can we be ideal about facing death, right? But I think there's an assumption under the claim that we think death is a bad thing. Death is undesirable, so we cannot be ideal about it. What if death we consider it as a transcendency?
What if we consider death as a transition state?
Yes. Let's say it helps us get rid of some unhappy things of the living life, and we go into that maybe imaginary, maybe existed, we know world, another world. If you think in this way, can death be a beautiful thing, and we should sing and dance for people who are dying instead of crying?
So I'm going to say that, so let me just rephrase the question in case everybody couldn't hear it, and you tell me if I don't get it right. In part, some of what the assumption is, and I think this is, I was trying to frame a cultural assumption, not so much say that death can't be beautiful, but I think our cultural assumption is it's not. So I think you're asking if we thought about it differently, would it then look, could you frame it so that it's not just ugly and difficult and horrible and something to be afraid of, but in fact could even be beautiful? And I think there's I'll say my thoughts, others may have other responses. I think that the fact of an ending can be a great gift and that we could look at it more like that. What I have seen in the hospice work is that leaving our bodies is very difficult work, just on the level of we're kind of used to running our livers and breathing, and stopping that is a process that people have to do a lot of hard work, and it can be hard to see. And I think not being prepared for those aspects of dying makes that process harder. So I think both things are true. How you think about dying definitely affects how you're going to see the death that you will be involved with in your life. And I think it's important to think about how to do that, not just as a hopeless endeavor. And I think it's important not to sugarcoat in terms of the difficulty of that process for most people. Yes.
So I'm really interested in the work that you've done researching pain management.
With
Pain management, and I think it's interesting you cite the sort of utter lack of pain management in a lot of Russian hospitals, and I have seen statistics in the past couple of years, they may be wrong now or updated, but the fact that the United States consumes 80% of the world's narcotics. And I'm just curious, maybe if you could conjecture or speak on why that is, and how, you know, U.S. patients manage pain differently than Russian patients do.
So I don't think we're great at pain management in this culture either, frankly, and I kept wanting to say that and interrupt myself in the Russian part, but decided that the narrative flow was more important. So, yes, indeed. We have much more access to narcotics, easier access to narcotics in this culture in our medical system. But hospitals in the U.S. tend actually to under-medicate, and many of the conversations that I was talking about in terms of Russia, I've also heard here. Actually, people will say, we can't give you that morphine because you're going to become an addict, and the person has 2 weeks to live, so it's really not an issue, and that happens in U.S. hospitals as well, and there are issues of medication diversion. But what does happen here that can't happen in Russia is every hospice patient gets FedExed a box that is for comfort or breakout care, and that will have some pretty serious drugs in it, so that if something happens in the middle of the night, you will have access to that medication. So if you go on hospice here, you can have access to that. In Russia, that's not true. And I think there are many reasons for that. I mean, I could tell you about how there were all these rules set up in Russia for access to the pain medications. It involved standing in long lines, it involved having to return the bottles, and it involved, if you needed, if you were prescribed 50 milligram pills of something and they didn't have that, but they had 101 that you could break in half, you couldn't get it that way. And so there are things like that that were very difficult. But in the U.S., I think it's although we have that greater access, doctors tend to underprescribe, and people tend to think, don't give morphine, that'll be killing. I mean, the typical image of hospice, right, is somebody with a morphine drip, right? And I have had many family members kind of come up to me and say, oh, we didn't realize, I'm sorry, I know this stuff is difficult to talk and think about, but it's what I talk and think about. So we didn't know that the choice was going to be for our mother to be screaming in pain or to have this morphine, and we pick having the morphine in that case. And so I think it is possible here when you're on hospice to have that access. It's harder in hospitals. Hospitals tend to under-medicate. And many families ask for that because they want to be clear. They want their relatives to be clear, or the person wants to be clear. If you're in a lot of pain, you're also not clear. So that's just a place where there are not good options, I think. Yes?
Yeah, I would just say, within the framework of kind of like Russian end-of-life care, outside of like the bureaucratic challenges faced by patients, do you think there's kind of an essential cultural barrier kind of built upon like the idea of like stoicism, like when you read like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and they have a certain attitude towards death and dying that is very different towards ours, almost as something to be faced rather
So
than
can you
in
speak up a little bit? I'm having trouble hearing.
Yeah, do you feel like there's like a cultural difference essentially in Russian attitudes towards death and dying that results in a lack of care? I was saying that when you read like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, when they think that death is something to be endured as opposed to kind of passed through, and is that something that would likely change ever?
So, so are you asking if I think that there's a cultural difference between attitudes towards
Yeah, like
suffering in
yeah,
the death and dying,
and does that play a part
thinking
in,
about Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and other,
yeah, does that play a part in how hard it is to get pain management?
to get the pain medicine? So, I guess when I think about this, so maybe I'm missing part of the question, because when I think about it, I think actually for me, reading those authors is part of what allowed me to have a little relief from my relentlessly cheerful mother, right? It allowed me to have a bad day and be able to count that as something that was just as important as being cheerful, right? And so my expectation then, and there's a greater, I mean, Death of Ivan Ilyich is still taught in medical schools in the US because it's such a good account, by Tolstoy's, because it's such a good account of the process that a person can go through who's dying. And so I would have expected, and maybe this is kind of crude on my part, but I would have expected there to be more openness in Russia towards death and dying than there is here, and I'm not actually finding that. There's a different kind of not openness maybe, and I do think that those, I need to know more before I say anything really authoritative about that, I think, but it is interesting to me that, that in Russia, it is so hard to get that kind of care for people. And it's hard here, but it's hard materially in Russia, which I think is partly economic, actually. But then I also think I can't just say that because attitudes drive economics, I think. And what you're going to put into the priorities in a budget they're also attitudinal. And there's many, many different reasons for that budget shift. But I do think it's a really interesting question about the cultural attitudes. I just worry about any statement that makes too black and white a divide about that. But I do think there are different ways that people see suffering, pain, death, and dying in many different cultures, including Russia and the US, and I do think you see it in the authors, because that's such a rich tapestry in Russia.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Ike's question. I was intrigued. When I was, I'm 57 now almost, and when I was a young man in the Soviet period, I found this very cool similarity between Russia at that point in terms of what appeared to me a more willingness to accept and understand death as a part of life that reminded me of old timers in America, where I remember an old woman showing me the dress that she wanted to be buried in, and she was very happy about it, wanted to talk about it. And I saw that sort of thing in Russia too. You know, the Russians have expressions like, "We'll all be there." That means, well, it's a part of life. "Все будет там." And the thing that they get together for the wake, and they get together 40 days later, and then a year later.
I love that. There's 9 days, 40 days, and a year. We don't have that. You have a remembrance.
And the family would wash the body and put it on the table. And to me, it felt like we had this weird fear of death so much that we didn't want to see the dead person anymore. We only wanted to remember them the way they were. So it seemed to me at the time, it seemed very healthy, that Russia's attitude. But I'm worried that maybe they're catching up to us in this sort of a cult of youth and eternal, immortality, that they're afraid to face that now, to hear these things coming. So.
Yeah, and it's something that others of you may be able to speak to in terms of that shift. I think that one thing that Gawande talks about in terms of the U.S., which I think is also true in Russia, is our medical knowledge has changed so much. We used to go to the hospital not because before antibiotics, not because you were actually going to get medical care, but because you got a little more attention, right? And with antibiotics and all the medical advances, it really shifted cure and lifespan. And when that happens, I think that does shift attitudes too. We don't expect to die as young, or as you don't see it as much. So, yes.
I'd like to follow up on Mark's story about the rituals and the process associated with death, dying, burial, and remembrance. During your presentation, I was really interested and intrigued by your phrase that in Russia, people today are just unfamiliar and afraid of death as Americans. And it was interesting because maybe in big cities, maybe in hospice.
I've been wondering about that too, but
if you go
promises.
in the provinces, it's usually the family who take care of elderly, and that's the family members, starting with little kids, old generations, being there with people dying, holding their hands in the conditions where there are no drugs to ease. They see what death is, and that's tied to the rituals. So those dying people usually do have their dresses, their towels, everything prepared for the burial. They leave their last 5 years with understanding that it's coming, and that's how things will be prepared. They have scenarios of how things should be done. Usually, if it's in the provinces and far away. So that's, in general, that's something that I'm not encountering here in the United States, where we prefer to go to the hospitals, where the families are so separated and far away. So I wonder if you can give a little bit more feedback.
So the question is, sorry.
The question is, so when you said that Russians, just like Americans today, are not familiar with death, or
I
are
don't
not
know that
really
I said that. I didn't
experienced,
mean to say that.
don't know what death is about, don't imagine that.
I do think that this problem you're seeing with pain medication and hospice care in Russia, I think there is, over and over again, people describe that as being, in part, about a less familiarity with death and dying and seeing it. But I think even in the statistic I quoted, where it's 4.4% of people in Moscow don't have adequate access, but 8.8 across the country do, and this is oncology patients. I mean, I think even there you see a difference in terms of, I mean, it's not a huge difference, it's nowhere near enough, but it's double. And so I guess what I'm trying to say more is I'm wondering, given this rash of suicides in Russia and the lack of capacity to have access to pain medications, what that means about people's attitudes about the mortal body. That's why I wanted to kind of be careful about how I said it, because it's such a huge country. You know, for me to say Russia, it's sort of like, well, Could I take Moscow, or could I take Petersburg, or could I take certain of the provinces? Because those attitudes are going to be different. I do know that that recently they have every 2 years they have a meeting of all hospice doctors, nurses, social workers, psychologists, and they had it in the provinces, and so I think that's actually an indication that there is more knowledge of dying in the provinces, more active daily knowledge of that.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could comment some about the role of religion in all of this. Because as we talk about U.S. approaches to dying, I would assume that that varies very greatly depending on religious community or religious commitment within the community or by the various members of the family. And if you could talk some about the differences within religions, please.
So differences in terms of religion about attitudes towards dying.
What maybe you've seen in hospice care, or if you've seen religion play a role in this?
Yeah, I do, and it plays, it plays a varying role. I think one of the really tricky things about dying is that people who have had a lot of faith can have that faith really shaken by a terminal diagnosis. I've also seen people of a great faith, of all faiths actually, do one of two things, and one is to have it really be a support for them and have it sort of ease the dying process and make that transition easier. I've also seen it be, we're going to wait for the miracle right up until the end, and has made that process much harder because there's no way to talk about, well, sort of like with Elena, the woman I talked about, part of that was faith. So I think it can have different kinds of effects. I don't know whether you were thinking about something specific.
Well, I started to think about it actually with Mark's question, because the sort of 9-day, 40-day mirrors 7 days, 30 days every week for Judaism. So if you're if you die and you're part of a Jewish community, and of course there's the Hebra Kadisha. So if you die as a Jewish person and you're going to be buried as a Jewish person, somebody sits with your body from the moment of death until it's in the ground, and it's
my
only
favorite.
the community.
That is my personal favorite tradition, actually, sitting Shiva.
This is even before Shiva, though. This
Yeah.
is the body until the grave. Shiva begins only after the
That's
funeral.
right. Sorry.
But so both the living and the dead are never left alone, and it's not a wake where you look at the body, it's only for the family.
Right.
But so when Mark was saying we don't have that anymore here, well, it's
Right.
it's the only way to be buried as a Jew.
That's a great
Or
point.
not the only way. Tam would get me on making
No,
anything
it's a great
monolithic.
point.
But so I'm wondering how that plays into what you see in the hospices, these different traditions.
Yeah, and I will say that probably often, I'll just give one example, but this is actually fairly, it's one of many. So one of the women I know who most gracefully accepted the dying process was Jewish, and she actually said to me, Jehan, I feel like I'm supposed to be having all of these profound conversations, and all I want to do is watch bad TV. Is that okay? And I said, what are you watching? Let's talk about it. And so we did. But she sort of, it was difficult for her, of course, but she made the adjustment that many people have to make much more gracefully than other people I know, and I think it was faith related. And when I say adjustment, it's sort of like this week you can sit up, and next week you're lying in bed, and then this week you can use the toilet, next week you have to use the bedside commode, then you're in diapers. I mean, it was sort of like a week-by-week process for her of loss, right? Those are the tangible losses that you have, and they're hard to adjust to. I'm not going to like that when it comes to my time for that, if that's my process. But, and she accepted that, and it was part of that it was part of that faith community, I think, that allowed that to happen for her.
I think something that I was kind of thinking about as some of the other questions were asked was, obviously there are different kind of rituals and different cultural contexts and different religious contexts for dealing with these things. But maybe, there's some kind of suggestion that maybe part of it also has to do with, economics and culture and religion all interacting in these various ways. And I'm thinking, a little bit about, Jean Baudrillard back in the 80s talking about American culture, this, what we call like the semi-yogic, semi-ecstatic cult of the body, where we could no longer kind of give a kind of meaning to a body. We can constantly sculpt it and obsess over it and try to preserve its youthfulness, but we don't quite know what to do with it. It's kind of a nihilistic process in a way. And I'm thinking as, this, I don't know if you were words you described as a cult of youth, coming to various kind of cultural contexts and people having to negotiate with the omnipresence of the youthful body, its kind of hegemonic status in various cultures. What do we do with that? What kind of sense can we make of that in light of that, right? Like how can that be negotiated? I mean, obviously people might still have their religious and cultural sensibilities in conversation with that, but it seems, at least to me and my generation and a lot of my friends, that there's a similar kind of sense that that's this youthfulness as the ideal and its inherent fragility is an anxiety that you all kind of share in various ways.
So how do you negotiate the anxiety of having the pressure to have a youthful, beautiful body? Is that part of what, it's a cultural phenomenon.
Right, and maybe some of the traditional supports are being pulled out from under us, What does it mean to negotiate that in light of this kind of commercial and cultural transition?
Well, that's a huge and wonderful question. I think that there are multiple answers and probably multiple wisdoms on that in this room. One piece of an answer related to my thinking is actually, I actually think that if we could be more aware of the actuality of dying earlier, what that actually means, that Bruce Kramer said about we're carrying that right now, if we could actually have that conversation at a deep level, from when we're very young on, I think it would shift that, but I almost think it would take that much to make that cultural shift. Now, what can we do now? I don't want to say, okay, so that's not going to happen, so there's nothing to do. I don't think that. But I do think that it's difficult because that pressure is very real. And I think that's partly why I think it's really important to begin to think about what it is to have an embodied knowledge that embraces vulnerability as well as a lack of vulnerability. And I think there's nothing easy about that conversation. It's hard. It was hard for me in my classroom to take that risk, for example, and continues to be hard. I keep thinking, nobody's going to want to talk about death and dying. I better stop teaching now. And in fact, people actually, even at 18, I teach a class to freshmen, do want to talk about it. I think this might be part of why, actually.
Is there any access to alternative treatments, alternative medication, or when people, for instance, a friend of mine had cancer and he was getting marijuana from help with the chemo and stuff like that, or other things that aren't part of pharma, that kind of thing. Is there any of that in Russian?
Yes, there's a lot of it.
Is it?
There's a lot of it. It has been effectively used in many, many ways. But I think when you get this kind of pain, it's generally pretty inadequate when you get to a certain level of pain. I just saw that we're at 5:30, so I think we might have time for one more question. There is one. There's one.
Hi, thank you for your talk, first of all.
and then I feel like I have another full-time job, which is tending to sick people and honestly helping family members die, that process. And what I've seen in hospitals over, I guess, the last 10 years is I think you're right. I think people have a really hard time, what I call reconciling to it. I see sort of a fear-driven denial on the one hand, and then also a sort of also just basically fear as sort of a means to keep it at bay. And I'm wondering, could you maybe talk a little bit about, if you think this is the case, how the way we have medicalized the dying process, in what ways does that impact our sort of existential inability to reconcile to death?
It's a great question. So how does our medicalized, the fact that we've medicalized this whole process, how does that contribute to our attitudes around dying? This is actually a lot of what Gawande's book is about, and he does a far better job of it than I'm about to, but I will say, I think it is in some ways the central question, that we gave up this process almost accidentally to the medical system and have not thought enough about what makes our lives worth living in that period and how to get there. So that we know pretty well what certain kind of treatment will lead to what kind of health outcome, but we know almost not at all how to have the conversation in any other way. And I think there's, every time I teach a class, a few of the students decide they want to become geriatricians. Nothing could make me happier, because that's one of the things. A lot of people don't want to go into geriatrics. It's not as well paid. People think things aren't fixable, so why would you want to do it? If you're going to be a doctor, you want to fix something. And this is a lot about managing medication and nutrition, and many geriatricians, some of them go on these sites, talk about you always have to look at the feet, because most people, a lot of times something catastrophic happens after a fall, right? And so if your feet aren't well taken care of, then you're more at risk of a fall. So I think I am not against medicine. I really am very happy that our medical care is as good as it is, but the healthcare insurance system is very broken in this country, and I think as long as we continue to think about this primarily as a medical problem and not thinking about what Gawande calls the fact that we all want to be authors of our own lives, we want to have autonomy as much as we have good medical care, that those things are very out of balance, and we need to be working to the autonomy. What he says is that that problem is compounded by the fact that most of us want, we want autonomy for ourselves and safety for those we love. And so, that problem gets compounded by that dynamic. And also because we have a great metrics for safety, but we don't have a great metrics for autonomy. So in terms of an insurance culture, you can say, well, we're doing all this to be safe, but we can't say we're doing all this and it's creating people's desire to live because they have greater autonomy. But I think that's a place that is beginning to be worked on. Did you have a question? I know, but you both had your hands up.
Well, just one, I've done a lot of work and continue to do a lot of work with the dying, and the Philip Simmons book, Learning How to Fall.
Yes, I read it, but I haven't read it. But I read it all.
Well, I'm working with this godchild now, but this is my fourth person with ALS. And I have used that book so often to see that it's not about dying, it is about living. It is a compelling book. I think it's the most spiritual book that I have. But I just want to comment because of how good it has been for me. It is an extremely good read. It's like 12 essays. It's independent, but it's just a tremendous book to read. Philip Simmons was a professor of English at Lake Forest College, and at 35 he learned he was dying from ALS, and he wrote through his eyes. He had 2 children, a wife. His wife is a fantastic artist, and still continues. But it's just a good read, Learning How to Fall by Philip Simmons. If you're interested in what we've been talking about, this can give you something good to look at.
Thank you for that. That's a very good note to end on.
My question for you, I'm at the sort of the time of life where I feel like I have a full-time job, and then I feel like I have another full-time job, which is tending to sick people and honestly helping family members die, that process. And what I've seen in hospitals over, I guess, the last 10 years is I think you're right. I think people have a really hard time, what I call reconciling to it. I see sort of a fear-driven denial on the one hand, and then also a sort of also just basically fear as sort of a means to keep it at bay. And I'm wondering, could you maybe talk a little bit about, if you think this is the case, how the way we have medicalized the dying process, in what ways does that impact our sort of existential inability to reconcile to death?
It's a great question. So how does our medicalized, the fact that we've medicalized this whole process, how does that contribute to our attitudes around dying? This is actually a lot of what Gawandi's book is about, and he does a far better job of it than I'm about to, but I will say, I think it is in some ways the central question, that we gave up this process almost accidentally to the medical system, and have not thought enough about what makes our lives worth living in that period and how to get there. So that we know pretty well what certain kind of treatment will lead to what kind of health outcome, but we know almost not at all how to have the conversation in any other way. And I think there's, every time I teach a class, a few of the students decide they want to become geriatricians. Nothing could make me happier, because that's one of the things. A lot of people don't want to go into geriatrics. It's not as well paid. People think things aren't fixable, so why would you want to do it? If you're going to be a doctor, you want to fix something. And this is a lot about managing medication and nutrition, and many geriatricians, some of them go on to sites, talk about you always have to look at the feet, because most people, a lot of times something catastrophic happens after a fall, right? And so if your feet aren't well taken care of, then you're more at risk of a fall. So I think I am not against medicine. I really am very happy that our medical care is as good as it is, but the healthcare insurance system is very broken in this country, and I think as long as we continue to think about this primarily as a medical problem and not thinking about what Gawandi calls the fact that we all want to be authors of our own lives, we want to have autonomy as much as we have good medical care, that those things are very out of balance, and we need to be working to the autonomy. What he says is that problem is compounded by the fact that most of us want autonomy for ourselves and safety for those we love. And so, that problem gets compounded by that dynamic. And also because we have a great metrics for safety, but we don't have a great metrics for autonomy. So in terms of an insurance culture, you can say, well, we're doing all this to be safe, but we can't say we're doing all this and it's creating people's desire to live because they have greater autonomy. But I think that's a place that is beginning to be worked on. Did you have a question?
Well,
I know, but you both put your hands up.
Well, just one challenge. I've done a lot of work, and continue to do a lot of work with the dying, and the Philip Simmons book, Learning How to Fall.
Yes, I read it, but I haven't read it. But I read it all.
Well, I'm working with this godchild now, but this is my fourth person with ALS. And I have used that book to, so often to see that it's not about dying, it is about living. It is a compelling book. I think it's the most spiritual book that I have not read. But I just want to comment on because of how good it has been for me. It is an extremely good read. It's like 12 essays. It's independent, but it's just a tremendous book to read. He was Philip Simmons was a professor of English at Lake Forest College, and at 35 he learned he was dying from ALS, and he wrote through his eyes. He had 2 children, a wife. His wife is a fantastic artist and still continues. But it's just a good read, Learning How to Fall by Philip Simmons. If you're interested in what we've been talking about, this can give you something good to look at.
Thank you for that. That's a very good note to end on.